Okay, so the IELTS speaking exam is broken down into 3 parts. We have part 1, part 2, and part 3. Now, for this video, I will share 3 mistakes for each part of the IELTS speaking exam, and then I will also explain what you can do to make sure that you do not make these mistakes. Mistake number 1. Not leaving enough time to prepare for your speaking exam. So, how much time is enough time? Well, in order to know this, we must first take a practice IELTS speaking exam, ideally with an English teacher. Now, once you've taken your practice speaking exam, your teacher will give you a band score. So for example, just say you are given a band 5.5. Now, usually, this is not always the case, but generally speaking, it takes about 2 to 3 months to improve by half a band. So for instance, just say you are given a 5.5, then you need a band 6. That way you will know that it should take you around 2 to 3 months to get to that band 6. If you need a band 6.5, then that will take you around 4 to 6 months of preparation time. Now obviously the time will vary depending on individual to individual, but generally speaking 2 to 3 months is enough time to improve by half a band. Mistake number 2 is giving short answers. Now a very silly thing to do is give one-word answers. So for example, in part 1 of the speaking exam, the examiner might ask you, what is your favorite drink? And you can just say Coca-Cola. But unfortunately, that answer is not good enough. What you should do is give a more developed answer. So for example, if the examiner does ask you, what is your favorite drink? You can say something like this. Coca-Cola is my favorite drink. However, when I'm on a diet, I like to drink water. So as you can see from this example, you want to give an answer that's around 2 or 3 sentences long. Now, how can you do this without getting stressed out? Well, one technique that works really well is just using the opposite. So let me explain what this means. So for example, if the examiner asks you, what is your favorite drink? Talk about that drink, but then mention why it might not be your favorite as well. So in this example, I mentioned that Coca-Cola is my favorite drink, but then I also said that water is better for me when I'm on a diet. So let's look at another example so we can do this together. So the example question is, do you like your current phone? You can just answer yes, but what you should be doing is saying something like this. Yes, I currently have the iPhone. I love it. However, it is extremely expensive. Can you see what I did there? I mentioned why I liked it, but I also mentioned one negative point about it. And you can do this with anything. If somebody asks you about your favorite food, you can talk about your favorite dessert. And then you can mention why you might not like that dessert as well. For example, it might be expensive, might be too pricey. You get the idea. Now, using memorized answers is one of the easiest ways to annoy the examiner. Now, I've examined many speaking exams in the past, and I can tell you it is very obvious when a candidate is using memorized answers. This is something that you should avoid at all costs. And the reason why you want to avoid this is because it makes the examiner feel as though you are trying to fool him or her. Okay, now you might have a couple of questions about this point. For example, why is it a bad idea to use memorized answers? And that's a good question. You might also be thinking, how will the examiner even know that I'm using a memorized answer? Well, from my experience, it's very obvious and very clear when the candidate does this. And here's how we can tell. You might speak at a slow pace, which is fine, okay? And then once it comes up to your memorized answer, people speak a lot faster, or they might speak a lot more fluently, okay? Now, the best way to make sure that you don't make this mistake is by doing 2 things. Firstly, just avoid memorizing answers completely, and also Give yourself enough time to prepare and actually start preparing for your IELTS speaking exam. Take many practice exam sessions. If you don't have anyone to prepare with, you can click on this video on the card above where I explain different techniques that will help you practice for the IELTS speaking exam. Now let's move on to the mistakes that people make in part 2 of the IELTS speaking exam. And the first one is sticking to the questions on the card. Now what does that even mean? Well, in part 2 of the IELTS speaking exam, the examiner will give you a card. Now on this card, there will be given a topic, and underneath the topic, there will be a few questions. Now on the screen is an example of what a card looks like. Okay, now these questions on the card that you can see are only there to help you. That means that if you cannot think of anything, you can use these questions to guide your answers. Okay, now you can answer these questions in the exam, but it is not a good idea to only stick with these answers. Well, these questions, if you answer them, you will realize that by the time you finish, you still have a long time left up until your 2 minutes finish. Now, you should just use these questions as a guide so you know what type of things that you can talk about. Now, just say that you do answer the questions on the card in your speaking exam and you do actually end up running out of time. Well, what do you do then? Well, there's a couple of things that you can do. And the first one is to just go back and answer the questions again. So let's see how this is done. So on the screen is an example card. Now you might be given something very similar to this card in your exam. So let's go through this, and what I'm going to do is answer these questions, and you will realize that I have a lot of time left. So I'll just go back and answer them again, talking about a different story. For example, describe a place you recently visited. You should say where you went, who you went with, how you got there, and explain why you enjoyed it. So, a place I recently visited was Cebu, which is in the Philippines. It's a popular island that lots of people like to visit as it is a tourist destination. I went with 2 of my very close friends. However, one of them I don't see that often because he now lives in a different country. And how we got there? Well, initially we flew out to Manila. So I got on a plane from Dubai all the way to Manila. And once we landed in Manila, we then hopped onto another plane and made our way to Cebu. And because Cebu is an island, we had to get on a small boat. So there was me, my 2 friends, the person riding the boat, and all of our luggage. And we made our way across the island on a boat, and around 30 minutes later, we arrived at our hotel. Now, the reason why I decided to talk about this place that I visited in particular was because I had so much fun there. There's many reasons why I enjoyed this place. Well, first of all, it was my first time visiting East Asia. And secondly, I wanted to visit Cebu for such a long time because a lot of my friends had been there in the past and they only had nice things to say about it. And also, I spent around 2 weeks just Googling photos of Cebu, and I realized that this place looks absolutely beautiful and I would love to see this place in real life. Now, as mentioned before, the questions on the card are only there to help you. You don't have to answer the questions on the card, but you must stick to the theme. For example, if the theme on the card is about traveling, you don't need to answer the questions about traveling that are on the card, but it is important that you stick to the theme of traveling when you are talking. So that was technique 1, where we answer the questions, and then once we finished, we go back and answer the questions again. And now the second thing that you can do is talk about the things that you like, and then talk about the opposite things, like we did before, where you talk about the things that you don't like. For example, if you are talking about your favorite holiday, you can talk about all the things that you liked about it. And then once you've finished, you can just say, however, there were some things that I did not like about the holiday, and then you can talk about the things that you did not like. And this technique works for almost all topics in part 2 of the speaking exam. Now, the next mistake that people make is stopping early in part 2 of the speaking exam. So in part 2, you are expected to speak for 2 minutes. Now, you will realize how slow time goes when you are speaking, especially when you time yourself. So when you're preparing for your speaking exam, if you just time yourself answering questions from part 2 and just see how long that takes, now the chances are that you will finish very early. This is a mistake that we want to avoid in the actual speaking exam. So what can we do that will help us speak for the full 2 minutes that are given to us? Well, there's a couple of techniques that we've already mentioned. For example, answering the questions and then going back and then answering them again. Another thing that you can do is talk about the 5 W's. Now, this is a technique that helps you with your planning. So, if you didn't already know, in part 2 of the IELTS speaking exam, the examiner will give you the card and then he or she will tell you that you have 60 seconds to prepare notes for your 2-minute speaking. Now, these 60 seconds are given to you to plan out what to say. It's not for you to write out word for word exactly what to say and then you will just read it out. No, what you should be doing is just making quick bullet points, and you can just look at those bullet points and then talk. So let's go back to our 5 W's techniques. This is who, what, where, when, and why. Okay, now if you just quickly make these bullet points in your 60 seconds of preparation, you just all you need to do is just answer these questions, and then when it's your time to speak for 2 minutes, you can just look at the card and it will remind you of what you can talk about. Okay, now another mistake that people make in the speaking exam is where they speak in a flat or a monotone voice. Now, what does this actually mean? So I want you to look at me and listen to what I'm saying. I love playing football. Football is my favorite sport. Even when I am not playing football, I like to watch football. Now here I was talking about how much I love this sport. However, you could not tell that I love this sport by my body language or by my voice because I spoke very flat. I was saying, I love football. Football is my favorite sport. I sound really bored of this sport. So what you should do is use intonation. Now, what is intonation and how can we use it? Well, intonation is when the pitch of your voice goes up and down when you speak. Now, this usually happens when we show emotion, such as when we are surprised, when we are happy, or when we are angry. So, for example, if the examiner asks you, do you like sports? You shouldn't just be saying, yes, I love sports. What you should do is say, yes, I really love sports, especially football. However, I hate basketball. Can you see how I'm stretching certain words to add emphasis? This is called intonation, and this is something that we should all be using in our speaking exam. It shows confidence and you will be marked on this area in the exam. Now, mistake number 7, but before we get into that, I know you're probably thinking, why do I look different? And that's because unfortunately, the last recording, there was a bit of an issue with the audio, so I had to re-record, which is what I'm doing now. Now, without wasting any more time, mistake number 7, and that is thinking you cannot ask the examiner to repeat any questions. So the questions that are asked by the examiner in part 3 of the IELTS speaking exam actually require you to think, and that can be quite challenging. So for instance, in part 1 of the IELTS speaking exam, you'll be asked questions that don't require you to think, okay? So for example, they might ask you, how many brothers and sisters do you have? And you don't need to really think about that. That's something that you already know. Or they might ask you, which city do you live in? So again, you don't need to think about that. But in part 3 of the IELTS speaking exam, you might be asked quite a complex question. For instance, you might be asked, again, based on the theme of traveling, which method of traveling do you prefer and why? So that's not a question that you will just know the answer to straight away. You might try to figure it out in your head. Well, I like cars, but are cars really good for the environment? I like planes, but they're quite expensive and I cannot get a plane every day. So again, these questions in part 3, they require you to think. So it's completely fine if you just take a moment just to pause and think. And if you forget what the examiner asked you, you can actually ask the examiner just to repeat the question. That is completely fine. Okay, now the next mistake is when somebody does not structure their answer. Again, lots of people make this mistake in both the writing exam and the speaking exam. Now we will talk about how this mistake happens in the writing exam in a different video, but let's focus on how we can avoid making this mistake in the speaking exam. So this mistake is basically when somebody does not structure their answer. Well, let's look at this example question and then let's look at these 2 answers that I've made. Now this question, I purely just designed this question just for the sake of this video. Is just so you can understand this example. So the question is, what makes a good student? Now I want you to look at both of these answers carefully and tell me which answer you think is better out of the 2. So here is answer 1. I think being on time makes a good student, and being polite and not being late. Let's see, what else makes a good student? Being polite to the teachers, did I say that? And doing your homework on time. That makes a good student. Okay, that is example 1. Now let's compare that to example 2. There's a few things that make a good student. Firstly, being respectful to students and the teacher. Secondly, completing homework. And finally, not being late to lessons. There's probably more things that make a good student, but these are the only ones I can think of at the moment. Now, can you see the difference between the 2 answers? The better answer out of the 2 was example 2, as you can tell. Now, why is answer 2 the better answer out of those 2 examples? Well, it comes down to structure. In the second example, we used words such as firstly, secondly, and finally. That puts things in order. And when you put things in order, it makes the structure of your speech a lot more organized and a lot more better. And this is what the examiner is looking for, again, in both the speaking part of the exam and the writing part of the exam. Now, these examples, they can still be further developed, but again, I just use these basic examples just so you can understand for the purpose of this video. Now, the next mistake is a mistake that I've not really seen many people talk about on YouTube or anywhere actually. And this mistake is not understanding how the examiner marks your speaking exam. If you know how your speaking exam is marked, then you will know exactly what to do to get your desired score. And the best thing about this is that if you're making this mistake can easily be fixed. All you have to do is just look at something called the speaking rubric. And this is basically the answer key that all IELTS examiners look at when they mark your speaking. And the best thing about it is that everybody can have access to it because it's online. In fact, I will put it on the screen now so you can take a screenshot of it, and I will also leave the link in the description below so you can download it and you can have a look at it in a bit more detail. Now, I'm going to put this back on the screen now, and I want to just briefly explain to you how your speaking exam will be marked. So as you can see, there are 4 sections here, and the examiner will mark your speaking according to each section individually. Now, each section is worth 25%, so they are all equal in weight, and they are marked individually. So what that means is that you can get a band 6 for section 1, band 7 for section 2, band 8 for the third section, and band 9 for the final section. And your final score will just be the average of all 4. Now, that brings us to the end of this video. If you've benefited from this video, please hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.